thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I hope that you find that presentation interesting. I'm more than happy to take questions, both during the presentation or in the end in the Q&A. So whatever works best. So this is joint work with Akseer Hussain, who is a colleague of mine based at York. So we did our PhD together at the same time. And as the title suggests, the aim of the paper is to study how electoral competition impacts economic development. So the motivation for this paper is that in recent years, or even recent decades, there has been more questioning of democracy, or at least democratic institutions. So we see this in a lot of survey data. We also see many commentators, both in the press and in academia, suggesting that democracy is not necessarily the best system to achieve economic growth. And of course, in recent decades, we have seen countries like China achieve very high levels of economic growth without democratic institutions. So that's the main aim of the paper. So before we start, the relationship between democratic institutions and economic growth is a complex one, as growth outcomes are influenced by several factors, not only if you have democratic institutions or not. So for example, natural resource endowment. So for example, if a country is rich in oil, it can achieve high levels of income. Historical legacy, so there's a lot of economic work that looks at the impact of how previous kind of historical events impact economic outcomes. So things like, for example, slavery, right, and the negative effect in both exporting countries, so a lot of African countries, but also countries that received a lot of slaves. So that's just one example of historical legacies, but there are many other examples that's discussed within economics. Big discussion also about the role of culture and how that impacts economics, although that's a bit harder to quantify. Nevertheless, that's also another big area in economics. But when we study all of those issues, we need also to keep in mind that the relationship between democracy and economic growth is not necessarily a linear relationship. So for example, different levels of economic development. So let's say if you have a democratic institution and you're a very low income country, that might be different. The impact of those institutions on economic growth might be different than if you're at a later stage of economic development. So the relationship between democracy and economic growth is not necessarily one that is linear. So what do we do in this paper? Well, we study whether and how electoral competition improves local economic outcomes in Pakistan. So basically, we look at economic growth and public goods. More specifically, we look at education and health. So we focus on Pakistan, which is a large, very volatile country that has seen repeated military interventions throughout its history. So later on, I'll show a slide that should illustrate the political volatility in the country. And of course, this volatility helps us study the impact of democracy on outcomes. So how and to what extent do democratic competition shape local economic outcomes in a young democracy? So there's a lot of research on the impact of democratization on economic outcomes, but Pakistan is interesting because it's a relatively young democracy, and all of those shocks, that means that you had periods of authoritarian rule, dictatorship, means that there's a lot of fluctuation in the short run. So that also adds to the motivation and means you can contribute a bit to this discussion. So if you ask why Pakistan, well, it's always an ideal institutional environment for studying the effects of changes in democratization on economic growth. So as I said, it's a volatility that makes it interesting to study the impact on the short run. So the country itself became independent from Britain in 1947, and since then it has had a lot of volatility. So our study, we looked data from the early 1990s all the way to 2018. And here you see our main measurement of democratic institutions. So that's the polity score. So when I speak about the data later on, I'll discuss in more detail what we mean by the score. But basically, this is a research project that looks at countries, and they give those countries a score from -10 to 10. 10 being democratic, fully democratic, the best. -10, the worst, kind of fully authoritarian. And you can see here there's some volatility. So we're interested to find out what's the impact of that volatility on economic outcomes. So we explore how the intensity of electoral competition influences economic growth and resource allocation. And we do that by using a novel combination of satellite-detected nighttime light as a proxy for economic activity. And then we combine that with electoral data at the district level. So some of you might be asking, why use satellite nighttime data? And that's because, as is common in many developing countries, there is not enough reliable data. Yeah, so you can have GDP at the national level, but once you go below the national level, there's not a lot of relevant data. So when you're studying a developed country, it's very easy because you can have very precise data about local GDP in sub-national units, even in municipality level. Yeah? So you can have all the data about unemployment, local GDP, household incomes. But when we study developing countries, we don't have that data. So there's a lot of research that has shown that satellite nighttime lights can be used as a proxy for economic activity. So what do we find? So we find that those constituencies or districts where there's more intense electoral competition, they experience higher nighttime light intensity. So that's a proxy for economic growth. Therefore, we argue that there's an association between having more electoral competition and at a later stage, more economic development. And we also find that there's greater provision of public goods, specifically health and education. We also find that those results are even stronger in periods where Pakistan had a higher score of its democratic institutions. So although we just run OLS regressions, so we don't argue that it's necessarily a causal relationship, we say there is a very strong association. And then I'll also show later on several robustness tests that we do that support our arguments. So how do we interpret those findings in the context of a simple political accountability model? So when you think about those districts or constituencies, so those are the level at which they held elections, and they will decide who they send to the parliament, whether it's the national parliament or the provincial parliament. So I have data for both the provincial ones and the national one. So we argue that one of the mechanisms is that because some of those districts are more competitive, therefore that means that politicians will have to pay more attention, and then they will going to, for example, invest more in those areas, and that investment then leads to higher economic growth. So I'll discuss that a bit more when I discuss the mechanism. So in a very simple way to put forward the argument is that voters, they have to make a decision about who to vote in party A, party B, candidate A, B, or C. And when they make that decision, they are going to take into account their own utility, so their own interests as well. So they're not just passive receivers, as some have argued in other segments of economics. I'll also discuss that a bit more later on. Broadly speaking, our paper contributes to three strands of the political economy literature. So first, we believe our paper is of interest to those that investigate the link between democratic institutions and economic growth. We also are of interest to those papers that look at electoral competition and its impact on economic growth and socio-economic outcomes. And last but not least, because we use nighttime light data, we might also be of interest to those that have an interest in this research topic. So I'll start first briefly going over the arguments about democracy, so democratic institutions, and economic growth. So from a theoretical perspective, the relationship between democracy and growth is ambiguous. So there are different mechanisms that run both ways. So there are potential negative effects of democratic institutions on growth, and there are potential positive effects. So at the end, depends on whichever effect is stronger. So as examples that have been discussed in the past, potential negative effects, so things like political gridlock. Yeah, so if politicians cannot agree to move forward, or they cannot form a functioning government, that might harm growth through different channels. So for example, that means that the country might not be able to do certain reforms. They might not agree budget. They might not agree investment. There's also pressure from interest groups. So that can also be detrimental to growth outcomes. So for example, if you have an interest group, they might try to influence politicians through lobbying, and therefore that might also extract rents from society and not have any positive effect on growth. Then there's also extreme kind of redistributive pressures. So we know that very high levels of inequality can be bad for economic growth, but also on the other side, if you redistribute a lot and you're not careful with how taxes affect incentives for both individuals and firms, that can also have a negative effect. So for example, if firms invest less in capital because of the way that tax works. And more broadly, you can also have distortional policies. Last but not least, populism. So that's a big topic nowadays. So populist leaders that promise things that they cannot achieve, they can do a lot of harm. And there's some recent research that shows that periods that have populist leaders leads to lower economic growth. So those are kind of the negative channels through which democratic institutions could theoretically impact growth in a negative way. But there's also some potential positive effects. So for example, there's some evidence that shows that more democratic institutions might lead for improved provision of public goods. So things like healthcare, education, and therefore better access to healthcare might mean people might be able to work, and therefore that might lead to higher rates of economic growth. Constraint on the executive authority, that also has been discussed a lot. Greater political stability, more inclusive economic institutions. So those are some of the positive channels through which higher levels of democratization can lead to higher economic growth. So when we look from a theoretical perspective, the effect of democracy on growth can be both negative and positive. So there are channels through which it can have a negative effect on growth, and there's channels through which it can have a positive effect. So the empirical question becomes, which one of those prevail in certain countries in certain time periods? So there has been a lot of work done on democracy and growth. First, early work in the 1990s looked at those kind of cross-country regressions. For example, Barrow in 1996, very famous paper. And they usually find a weak or negative effect of democracy on economic growth. Some late 90s, early 2000 articles found that the relationship was non-linear. So what do we mean by non-linear? It means that if we improve democracy, it does not mean that always you're going to get more economic growth. So it might depend on things like the stage of democratization, the stage of economic development. Then we had some panel data studies that generally find a positive effect of democracy on growth. And more recent, we have some more recent papers like Acemoglu and now 2019 Journal of Political Economy paper that uses an IV strategy and argues that democracy does lead to higher economic growth. So when you look at the empirical, you get mixed results. So it also contributes to the impact of electoral competition and economic growth. So there are many papers that look at specifically this issue about how competitive an election is and its impact on economic growth. So politicians allocate resources, and when they allocate resources, they really have three options. One is that they could make decisions only based on their technical aspect. So for example, they could make a decision what is best for the country on their opinion. So that would be one option. But that's not always the case, especially in developing countries, but also even in developed economies, we know that that's not always the case. So for example, they might allocate resources to some of their core supporters just to keep the support, or they might also allocate resources to what we call here swing voters. So those are kind of the districts that they think they could win if they invest more in those areas. So core voters are usually consistent in terms of how they vote. So they vote for the same party, and they usually expect something in return. Swing voters tend to vote more based on the evaluation performance of a candidate. So swing voters are more kind of open-minded, so they can vote on whoever they think will bring more benefits to them and their community, their families. So in terms of electoral competition, for example, there's some papers that look at some developing countries. So in Brazil, for example, 2013 finds that higher electoral competition leads to more local public goods in terms of school enrollments, teachers, some health outcomes. In India, greater competition across states leads to higher per capita income. Also in Sweden, so there's a lot of papers on electoral competition and growth and kind of socio-economic outcomes. I'm not going to go over all of them now because of the time constraint. And third but not last, we also contribute to this, which is quite a recent new development in economics about using satellite data to measure economic outcomes as a proxy for GDP. So there are some papers, I'll just emphasize the 2021 paper, which argues that this can provide an alternative to government data. So for some countries where you both have reliable GDP data at the subnational level and also satellite data, we can then compare and see if there's a correlation, a high correlation. So some background information for those that are not very familiar with Pakistan. It has experienced a very turbulent political history, as I said previously, alternating between democratic governments and dictatorships. I mean, since its independence in 1947, the military has ruled the country for 32 years, lasting power from 1999 to 2008. So it's a very large country, over 240 million people. GDP per capita very low. So one of the among the lowest GDP per capita. I mean, some estimates put it at below, in nominal terms, below $2,000 per year. It also has a mixed record in growing its economy. So there are periods of high economic growth, followed by periods of economic stagnation. So I'll briefly discuss the political background so you can understand when I show you the data, where it comes from. So since the 1973 Constitution, it operates a federal parliament where there are three tiers of government. So at the national level, you have the lower house, which is the National Assembly, and at the upper house is the Senate. So those are both elected by the population. And you also have the provincial assemblies. So each province has its own unicameral, and both are elected by the population. So the National Assembly, they are elected through a first past the post system. So that's quite similar to what we get in England. Now, just keep in mind that some of the seats are reserved for minorities. Again, the National Assembly has a lot of power, things like executive oversight, financial powers. It might propose law, debate, vote on new laws. The Senate has, different from the National Assembly, the Senate has some veto power over constitutional amendments, so it's a bit more powerful. And we argue that both houses of parliament can influence economic growth and development through several mechanisms, such as investment, infrastructure, and so forth. The provincial assemblies, so that's the subnational unit, are located in their respective capitals, and again, their members elected by the population. They are to represent their interests. So it has authority over many areas like criminal law. It also makes sure that law aligns with their Islamic principles, constitutional mandates, federal law. So it has a lot of responsibility. And a brief note is that over time, so those regional assemblies, the provincial assemblies, they also have power. So they're not, over time, they were granted more power. So it means they have an impact as well. So it's not only at the national level, but also at the local level that we argue that politicians can have an impact on growth and socio-economic outcomes, depending on the way that they distribute resources.
Do they have tax raising powers?
Which one?
The provincial one. The provincial assemblies. Do they? You've mentioned laws aligned with Islamic principles, constitutional mandates, so on. I just wonder whether they could raise a tax.
I think so. I cannot guarantee. I can ask Mike later on. Yeah, that's a good point. So we studied the period 1990 to 2018. So during that period, there was a total of 6 elections. So 1990, 1993, 97, 2002, 2008, and 2013. On those 6 elections, they were dominated by 2 political parties. So those 2 political parties were the ones that dominated most of Pakistan politics since independence, which they are the Pakistan People's Party and the Muslim League. So the People's Party tends to be a bit more to the left. The Muslim League tends to be a bit more to the right in their political spectrum. So here you can see, so this is data from 1947 all the way to 2018. So this is right after independence, and the green period is when you had some kind of democracy. The red one, some kind of dictatorship. So again, we're classifying democracy and dictatorship based on the polity scores. So that's how we classify. And you can see here that Pakistan People's Party, and at some periods there were both parties alternating power. Now, this is the period that we study. So starting from around the 1990s all the way to 2018. And we have this period here where you have a dictatorship. So I'll move on now to briefly discuss our hypothesis and our mechanism. So our main hypothesis is quite straightforward. So our original hypothesis was that we expected electoral constituencies, so those districts where there are more intense competition, will end up having a higher level of economic growth and public good provision at a later stage. And the mechanism that we argue is that political institutions, they mediate whether safe or swing districts receive more fiscal support. So for example, if the government wants to build a new school or a new health facility for the population, so it might take into account where the voters are, and if it can also get some votes, right? So it's a question about making decisions not only based on what's best, but also on the political side. So as I previously argued, government funding can be influenced by politics and also technical criteria. So there are three main allocation mechanisms. One is when a ruling party or a coalition votes for the areas that support them. And this can happen both in developing countries, but also developed economies, where you just dedicate more resources to those areas that support your party. And you do that because you expect to be re-elected and get rewarded at the next election. You can support opposition areas if they are swing regions. So for example, if you think that, okay, we can invest more in that area and then we might get more votes. Or technically, you could also distribute funds based solely on technical criteria. So you can, for example, ignore local politics and argue, I'll have a look at which areas need the most and then distribute those resources. So what will you, of course, if the government decides the technical criteria, so just following, try to do what's best overall, given the information it has. Nonetheless, what will decide if they go for support in the areas, the ruling areas, or if they decide to invest more in the kind of opposition area, is how risk averse that government is. So it can be a risk averse, or it can be high risk taking. So for example, if let's say a political party wants to get re-elected and it wants to increase its vote share, it could, for example, invest more on opposition areas to try to gain that vote from those from that part of the population. So swing voters, so those are the voters that change around how they vote, can be targeted to gain support from previously unsupportive segments. Now, when we talk about how voters vote, as is the case in many of developing countries, we have this question about how do people vote, and there's always discussion about this kind of patron-client relationship. So are people kind of passive receivers, or do they just receive public goods and then vote on the candidate that they have been voting always? So there's kind of relationship where the state provides goods and services, or if it's some kind of transfer, and then they just vote on the same party over and over again. Or do they have some kind of choice, and they can argue that, okay, I'm going to vote for whichever party I believe will offer me a better government services, or kind of will try to vote for the party that will improve my life. So a lot of the times, for example, some have argued that because a country like Pakistan is very, very poor, that the voters are just going to vote based on the party that gives them some kind of transfer payments or offers them some more kind of healthcare, and they don't really have any choice. But if our hypothesis is correct, so if we have those kind of districts that voters swing, so they change their vote. So if this is correct, it shows that it's not always the case that part of the population just accepts whatever the ruling party says and just keeps voting on them and keeps supporting them. So that means they're not just passive receivers of goods, and they can have their own opinion, and they can also change their minds, and they can vote independent of whoever dominates the local politics. So a lot of electoral campaigns often result what is called implicit contracts, where politicians, both at the provincial level and at the National Assembly level, are expected to prioritize direct services for the population, such as facilitating some kind of transfer just to get their vote. So that's discussed a lot. But when I'm going to show you the results that we get, we kind of challenge a bit this idea that the population is just passive and is not trying to vote to also improve their lives, and using democratic institutions as a way to make a judgment about their leaders. So, for example, we find that swing constituencies, so those that are competitive, receive greater public investment due to electoral incentives. Now, something also to keep in mind is that because of really lack of data, we don't really test with whatever mechanism is there. So it could be, for example, that it might be budget allocation. So for specific projects, it might be how members of parliament behave. So there might be many different factors that might influence why in some areas voters might change the way they vote. But we don't really formally test this with our data. So we know that that's probably one of the mechanisms, but we cannot say in detail exactly what's the mechanism, if it's kind of financial, if it's some kind of service. So we cannot really say that. So in our paper, we just discuss potential mechanisms, but we don't really go into detail and formally test them with the data. Briefly speak about the data that we use. So those are the four main data sets that we use. So the first is nighttime light data, then we use electoral data, then we have the polity data and the public goods data. So I'll start with the nighttime light data. So as I said previously, we use nighttime light intensity as a proxy for measuring local economic development from 1992 to 2018. So if you're not familiar with these, I think most of you might have seen, there's a very famous photo from space where you see North and South Korea. In South Korea, there's a lot of light, and in the north, it's all dark. Yeah, so that's a classic photo. So that's more or less what we do. So we use nighttime light data as a proxy for measuring local economic activity, because there's no reliable data. So there's no reliable GDP data below the national government, so below the whole country. So where do we get the data? We get the data from three different sources, and then we combine the data together. We just follow what's common and just use the average nighttime light. So use the average, we take an average. We also avoid background noise. So those are things like if it's very cloudy, there are some, or if you have, let's say, northern lights, those things can also impact this data. But we build our data set from the early 1990s all the way to 2018 using three different sources of nighttime light data. So this is the average nighttime data, and you can see again here from 92 all the way to 2018. Blue is the democratic period, red dictatorship. So this is data from 92 to 2018. And again, you can see a lot of variation. So this is the map of Pakistan, and you can see here, these are different districts. And what we do is that we overlap the map with the nighttime data, something like this. Not the best photo, but hopefully you can understand more or less the idea here. So again, the areas that are more bright, they show more economic activity at night, and therefore there's a very high correlation between those economic activities and GDP per capita. So we have 6 elections, as I said, 1990, 93, 97, 2002, 2008, and 2013. Now we exclude the 2002 election from the data set and from our regression model, and that's because in 2002 there was kind of a reorganization of local government. So it was a very big reorganization, and then it changed back again. So we received this comment from reviewers that we should exclude 2002 elections from our data. So it means that another brief comment is that those electoral districts, they change over time. So as the population grows, they redraw those maps. But again, this is an issue that any kind of research that looks at time series data, they find that as the population grows, sometimes electoral districts, they change over time. So we just use the standard way, which is to calculate a proportion of voters in the parent constituencies, using 2002 as the benchmark. So how do we measure electoral competition? It's a difference between vote shares of the winning candidate and the runner-up candidate. So that's mathematically, that's the equation that we use. So it's votes received by the winning candidate in constituency C at election time T, minus the vote received by the runner-up candidate. So the one that wins minus the runner-up over the total valid votes in that election. And we create 3 dummy variables to measure how competitive the elections are. So if they're up to 2%, up to 5%, or up to 10%. So we also then construct a swing that shows if a constituency remained competitive at a particular winning margin in at least 2 or 3 elections. So we want to know is like, let's say, is this constituency competitive in one election, but then not the other? Is it competitive election 1, 2, 3, 4? So how does it change over time period? So let's say swing of 2%, we represent with a dummy variable equal to 1 if it has remained competitive at a winning margin of 2% in at least 2 elections or 3 elections. Otherwise, it equals 0 in our data set. And we do the same for swing at 5% and swing at 10%. Now, with the polity score, so that's a measurement of democratization. So again, the measurement goes from -10 to 10. From -10 to -6, we say it's an autocracy. From -5, sorry, there's a typo here. From -5 to 5 is in between, and anything above 5 is considered democratic. So it's just different levels of democratization. So 10 is the maximum. Anything above 5 is already considered a democracy, not a full liberal democracy, but still democratic. And the classification looks at things like executive recruitment, constraint on executive power, political competition, institutions. And last but not least, we look at also both educational and health facilities. So I look for, on the educational side, the number of primary, middle, and high school. And for the health facilities, hospitals, basic health units, rural health centers. So the different classifications of health facilities, always using per 1,000 people as standard. So we want to know what's the number of health facilities available in that region, taking into account the overall population. So here we can see these are all different types of health facilities, different lines, and you can see what's happening. So that they go down, the numbers, and they increase at a later stage. And the same here for primary, middle, and high school. So this is just some descriptive stats. I will just go through them fast because of the time. So just briefly now go over the model that we run and then the results. So our main model to study the relationship between electoral competition on local economic development. So we run this model. We have nighttime lights in constituency C in time T equals, this is our coefficient of interest, our margin. So it's a binary treatment. So as I said, it's 1 if the victory margin in the previous election is specified at 2%, 5, or 10%. Otherwise, it's a 0. So just a binary variable. We use time and year fixed effect, constituency fixed effect. Again, we just cluster the error terms at the constituency level. So that's the main model that we run. We also, to analyze the distributional gains of swing constituencies under each polity system, we run the following regression. So what we do here is to try to understand what's the impact of the swing on the and the democracy score. So what we do, we create this interaction term between the swing and the polity true score. So again, we have on the left side nighttime light intensity in constituency C, year T, equals our interaction term with the swing at, which is the dummy variable, at 2, 5, and 10%, with the interaction with the polity, and then we have constituency fixed effect, year fixed effects. So those is kind of the two main regressions that we run. So now I'll show you some of the results. So as I told you, the coefficients that you see here, the coefficient of interest, is the nighttime. So it's the change in nighttime. Okay, so for example here, we get 0.086, or 0.082, or 0.087. They're all positive, and they're all statistically significant. Then you might ask, how do we interpret those coefficients? Yeah, what's the relationship between the nighttime and the GDP? So we do this both for the National Assembly and the provincial assemblies. So I have more than 7,000 observations for the national one and 15,000 for the provincial assemblies. So how do we interpret this? So the results suggest, for example, here in column 1, that electorally competitive constituencies have higher nighttime light intensity than non-competitive ones by around 9% and 11%. So how do we interpret this? So we just follow the literature that argues that there's an elasticity of around 0.3. What does it mean? It means that a 1% increase in nighttime light corresponds to roughly 0.3% increase in GDP. And if you do the calculations, so if you multiply 9 by 0.3 or 11 by 0.3, we get a range between 2.7% and 3.4% of higher GDP. So yeah, so that's the 0.3 here, is just what's widely used in papers that use nighttime light. So 1% increase in nighttime light corresponds to roughly 0.3%. I mean, there's some discussion about how precise this is, but that's generally accepted as around 0.3. I mean, those things might always change a bit depending on the local context, but that's what's the value that's mostly used. Now then we look at the second set of results, is when we have interaction between so that's the interaction between the swing, 2, 5, and 10%, and the polity score. So that's the democratic score in that constituency in that year. So here we create the interaction. Panel A, swing versus the polity score at 2, 5, and 10. So that's overall, and then panel B, we just take into account when polity score is above 5. Why above 5? Because that's when it's considered democratic. Yeah? So anything below 5 is not considered democratic. And then again, we get positive results. And you can see here, for example, the results in panel B are slightly stronger. Therefore, they're positive. So it shows that once you have a higher level of democracy, we seem to get higher nighttime data. So we also do this for both. So this is for the National Assembly. We also do this for the provincial assemblies. We also get positive coefficients. Especially here you can see the result of the interaction term. We also do this for looking then at public school provisions and health facilities. So again, we get here, positive interaction when you look at schools. So that's all the different measurements of education that we have. Primary, middle, high school. And with health facilities, again, positive and statistically significant. All the different health facilities. Now it's also another slide here, running out of time. So what can we conclude from the main results? The observed increase in nighttime light intensity in competitive constituencies therefore reflect not only short-term distributive gains, but also the potential for more durable economic development. So we argue because this is very short run, so we don't have enough data to go back decades past, but nonetheless, if this is short run, there might be some hope that this continues also in the long run. So the main implication for this is that even imperfect democratic competition, and again, no one here is arguing that Pakistan is a perfect liberal democracy, can generate meaningful development dividends by disciplining political actors and encouraging more inclusive patterns of public spending. Now, I'll briefly now go over the robustness test that we do, because we do several standard robustness tests. So first we start by the political business cycle. So what we mean by that? So we know from the literature that usually governments, they might spend more money in the year before the election to try to increase support and guarantee their re-election. So what we do, we run a regression by excluding the preceding year of the election from our sample. So we drop all the previous years right before the election from our sample, and still the results hold. Now, another concern is also that, as the map usually suggests, the large cities, right? They have a lot of nighttime light, right? So the intensity is very strong. But rural areas, they have much less. Yeah, there's less people around. So as you move from the very large large cities to the urban areas, you get much lower. And there's always this concern that our results might be based on this kind of, that we might be not capturing the impact of democracy on economic growth and development, but just we might be, let's say, capturing the impact of rapid urbanization, right? So in this period, some people moved to large cities were expanding, so we might be capturing this instead of the impact of democratization on development. So what we do, we drop all the urban constituencies from our sample, and still the results hold. So even if you drop all the urban areas, you still have a positive effect. Yeah, so that kind of indicates that the results are not driven by the very large cities. Because of course the light brightness is highly prevalent in urban areas. We also use an alternative measurement of electoral competition. And if we use our alternative measurement of electoral competition, the results also hold. We also play around a bit with the dynamics of nighttime light by creating some lag values for light, and then the results also hold. I'm not going to show you all the tables, but in the published version, there should be all the tables showing that the results hold. We also run several regressions using different measurements of school and health facilities and outcomes, and the results also hold. So to conclude, our finding complements a very large body of political economy research that looks at how political competition shapes welfare outcomes and economic growth. And our results for Pakistan are consistent. So there's a lot of papers that find also that that more electoral competition has benefits for both economic outcome and social economic outcomes. So things like access to healthcare and access to education. I'd just like to highlight our contribution is that first, how quickly democratic practices take hold following a period of autocratic rule. So we look at the very short run. So it means that those changes are very short run. So it's kind of moving from a score of, let's say, -4 to -2 or even to 4, 5, 6 in the very short run. And there seems to be an effect. I mean, Pakistan is best described as a young democracy. And we show that public good provisions, even if targeted to swing voters, seem to increase under democratic rule. Now in our paper, because we just run OLS regressions, we stop short of calling this a causal effect. So we say there's an association between more electoral competition, so high electoral competition, and economic development. But we don't really argue that it's a causality just because it's an OLS regression. But I think that with the robustness test, it's a very strong correlation. Thank you. I'm on time, right?